All right, welcome everyone. A few weeks ago when I first started with this idea of trying to help everyone with kids and students going back to school in the era of coronavirus, there was someone that I really wanted to have as a special guest, and we have her. And it's Dr. Helen Hsu. She's a staff psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University, and she's also past president of the Asian American Psychological Association. And she just has an amazing skill set to deal with some of these mental health issues as we try to help our families, navigate COVID-19 and get back to school in whatever way that is. So why don't we go ahead and get started with the conversation. My name is Reggie Burton, and I'm the president and founder of the Avery Burton Foundation. What we try to do is we try to do outreach and advocacy on behalf of mental health and really try to get people to resources. If someone is experiencing some sort of mental health issue, we really want to be able to help them identify the problem and connect them with resources. And I think we have someone here today that's really going to be able to help us with that. So Dr. Hsu, I think I may have mentioned to you that earlier this year, I took a mental health first aid course for youth and adolescents. And that was before COVID. And I had no idea I was going to be using it as much as I've been using it, starting the foundation because of what happened with my son, Avery Burton, and having a mental health major depressive episode. So I thought that was a really good thing to add to my toolkit. So I decided to get the adult certification. So I took the pre-test today. And one of the things that is very consistent, I wanted to maybe start there, is we try to come up with different tips to help people. And one of the things that we talk about is algae. So I'm going to go to my whiteboard, and hopefully everyone can see it here. I don't know if I have it up on my screen. Can you see that, Dr. Hsu?
Nope, not yet.
Okay. I don't know why it's not letting me see it on the screen. Well, if you can't see it, I'll just read through what it is. It's the Mental Health First Aid Action Plan, and it's ALGAE. So the A stands for assess for risk. So basically assess if someone is in a critical stage and maybe potentially with suicidal ideation. Listen, be a really good listener. Give assurance that everything is going to be okay. The first E is encourage, help them identify resources. And then the second E is encourage self-help. So that's ALGAE. So that's kind of a short version for trying to help people like me, myself, that's not a professional such as yourself, to remind us of how we can be an ally and how we can help our students and our loved ones if they are in mental stress. So Dr. Hsu, I wanted to ask, maybe to start with, what are some of the tips that you'd recommend for families with students heading back to campus, whether it's a hybrid or online or whatever the case may be, to help them navigate and reduce some of the stress associated with COVID-19?
Thank you for having this space and just even gathering us that mental health first aid, mental health awareness in our communities to fight stigma and increase access is fundamentally pretty much what I've been doing for my whole career, that we come to this, right, not just as a professional or an educator, but as a community member and as someone who's been in therapy, so a client, as well as a loved one, and watched people that I really cared about struggle with different health and mental health issues. So we're very much in this together. And how do we ensure, yes, and like you were saying, pre-COVID, this was already a really common topic that if you look at the developmental stages of young people, like we know very well, I serve a college population now, that between the ages of 15 to 25 is the most likely time that youth are going to experience a major mental health setback. That's an age where there's so much going on in life that's very exciting and new, but then also potential has vulnerabilities, and it's just physically the final stages of prefrontal lobe development when they're vulnerable. So there's definitely, I think, that 15 to 25 age, really wanting to provide people with supports and information. And then, of course, everything now with sort of the uncertainty and the disruption, we're seeing, you know, much younger kids really feeling the stress, including our stress as adults, right? That how do we all live in an age of uncertainty? And I think there is a piece of how do we manage ourselves and equip ourselves with as many tools and resources as possible so that we can even be moderated enough to then support our kids. And there's a piece of that which is mental health education. So whether that's formal programs or just knowing where are your resources locally. And we're lucky that there's a lot of fairly reputable resources online, right? I always say, like, if there's any message that I hope you can convey to your students, the people in your family, is that if you don't know the answers for what's going on, because we're all going to have things that we don't, that you will find out, or you will find out together. And it's also really important to convey that you are committed to help and support your student or your family member, even if you're presently angry or disappointed. It's quite sad how many 18-year-olds do show up on college campuses and say to us, I wanted counseling when I was younger, but I always thought my parents would refuse or freak out, or they don't believe in therapy or something, but there were reasons, whether that was explicitly stated or they just thought it, that was a barrier for getting help. So I think really thinking about how do we remove the stigmas and the barriers to help seeking.
Yeah, no, you said some really valuable things there, and I just want to kind of go back and hit on a couple of those points.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for the students, like in a normal year, Dr. Hsu, a lot of students would be with their parents attending some sort of orientation. I mean, I have two college graduates and, you know, a freshman just enrolling this fall
Mm-hmm.
in college, and I remember those orientations were very valuable. But this year is different, of course. This is not a normal year where some of the orientations maybe are being done online. And what the families are missing, in my experience, is they're missing, you know, being able to identify on a map maybe where the mental health resources are on campus.
Mm.
You know, we know so much about where the libraries are and, you know, the other resources, but the mental health resources sometimes gets left out. So I think your point about identifying those resources and sort of being proactive about it is great. And I wanted to mention for those of us, or those of you that are just joining us, we're with Dr. Helen Hsu. She's a staff psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. And we're discussing mental health back to school in the coronavirus era. This, if you missed any portion of the discussion at this point, it will be posted on YouTube at averyburtonfoundation.org. So we're very grateful to our special guests to spend some time with us and give us some insight. And in terms of resources, Dr. Hsu was very gracious to send some resources ahead of time. So I will get those posted on our website, so you'll be able to have access to some of that as well. In the remaining time that we have just a short bit of time here. I wanted to kind of transition into an area that I think you really do a great job of emphasizing, which is cultural competency in some of the mental health therapeutics. And so many parents are struggling from an economic standpoint. If their kids are not going to school this year, how are they able to access the mental health resources? Is it through a healthcare plan? Sometimes those healthcare plans can go well. Sometimes they can be a little bit challenging. And I'll tell a brief story. So Dr. Hsu and I met when I was promoting my book in the Bay Area. This is Depression is the name of my book. It's written about my son Avery, who had a major depressive episode in 2017. And you can read about his story on our website, averyburtonfoundation.org. But as I was promoting the book, I wanted to make sure that the media had an opportunity to actually get some professional sourcing. And Dr. Hsu was very kind to fill in and provide that. But one of the things that stood out is talking about your background as past president of the Asian Association of Psychologists and the work that you're doing there and how important that work was. I got to know firsthand when I did another book signing event in Torrance last December. And I met a Japanese mom, actually mixed Japanese and Mongolian. And her son was also mixed with Japanese and Mongolian. So she had some very specific issues and concerns because they had just moved to the South Bay area of Southern California in Torrance. And there were some concerns about bullying and some other issues. So I asked her son, I said, what do you think the problem is? And he said, I feel like I'm being discriminated against. And I think I remember some of the conversations you and I had about the psychiatry industry itself is very white. We'll just call it that. It's 90% Caucasian. And so for those Asian families who are trying to deal with issues that are cultural, that can deal with everything from model minority myth and understanding and navigating that, you really do need a culturally competent therapist who understands some of those issues. So I shared that with this mom and she literally started crying. She had not had a therapist or anyone who had ever even mentioned that concept to her. So I said, Monday morning, you need to call your health plan and you need to ask for that. So can you talk a little bit about that, the importance and the role of cultural competence in the work that you're doing?
Right, the access issue. So we have a huge problem with access to begin with in this country, which is a whole other topic, like parents really needing to fight and advocate to get services or find them. And then on top of that, if once you're able to secure that, then it's the competence issue, right? Like, can you find a provider that has any kind of cultural humility and experience? Like, I'm very fond of reminding people, like, even as the president of the Asian American Psych Association, I'm not the expert on every Asian. And our colleagues and friends in Black, Indigenous, Latinx communities, they kind of talk about the same thing, that you don't want to use your precious therapy or counseling time, which is expensive and takes time, to have to explain your communal family values or, you know, racial bullying or traumas or identity issues that may be coming up, and our intersectional identities, especially with young people in high school, college, young adulthood. There may be sexual orientation identity, you know, finding your place, your peers, your chosen family, as well as your racial identity. And is there a therapist who has some experience and humility in all of that? Maybe one of the only good things about most therapy moving now to telehealth is that you're no longer as limited by location. So for example, I had a friend who was asking me for, do you know a Kaiser therapist that would be a good recommendation for me as an Asian American young man at a certain life stage? And, you know, I'll be honest, I have not been impressed with a lot of the Kaiser therapists that are in my region, but because of telehealth right now, I was like, you know, actually there's a couple people I know who are Asian American who are at this other Kaiser who's much farther, but for right now you could access them. So it is okay to ask your health plan or your school, like, what is this person's experience? And who can I see that isn't going to actually make things worse by microaggressing against me or stereotyping me or my family and who actually maybe has some wisdom to share about how do people navigate things right now, like racial trauma is and systemic injustice. For many of us, this is not a new topic in this country, but for some people, including some therapists, it is.
Yeah, you make a really good point, and I think as we think about kids going back to college, they're going to not only be navigating college in this coronavirus global pandemic, but also navigating some very difficult issues that are being debated online
Mhm.
regarding racial justice issues. So I think that's a very good point to make as well. And I think, again, we're here with Dr. Helen Hsu. She's a staff psychologist and lecturer for Stanford University, and she is our special guest as we continue our educational webinar series on back to school in the coronavirus era. So with that, one of the things that I wanted to, in our remaining time, discuss with you is this idea that I thought about when I was writing my book. This is Depression is really more of a sort of a narrative story, and doing some of my own research and trying to understand some of the ideas behind what you need to look for, what you should be looking for as parents, and trying to understand the seriousness and the dangers of mental health. One of the themes that I walked away with, just looking at my own personal experience with my kids, is that depression doesn't discriminate. And I mean that not in a diverse way that we were just discussing in terms of cultural competency, but just literally regardless of gender, economic status, region where you grew up, where you were raised to a certain degree. Certainly triggers can impact the effects, but can you speak to just sort of this idea and this concept that it doesn't discriminate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, depression, anxiety, all the other mood disorders, the spectrum. There's a term now called neurodiversity, understanding that we have very different neurological diverse traits, whether that's on the Asperger, autism spectrum, our mood disorders, some of us more severe, others just subclinical, others in good mental health. This doesn't discriminate. And as we often see, people will say, oh, wow, how could, say, famous people with lots of money or very smart people still get afflicted just the same rates, actually, as everybody else? And what's troubling, I think, for parents is if you actually look at the data, rates for depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation have actually been steadily increasing in the United States for about the last 15 to 20 years. So clearly there's things about the way our education, our society is structured, that is really not very healthy for young people. And so that's a very real concern as parents, to be checking in with how do we support them, normalizing that this is an okay thing to talk about as we check in. And the best way to normalize it is by demonstrating it. I've had young people say, my parents are going through a really hard thing, and I suggested that maybe they want to talk to somebody, and they took it as very offensive. Well,
Wow.
then how do you expect your child then to feel okay to say something to you? One of the kids in my family had told their parent recently that they want to see somebody for their anxiety, and the parent was like, I don't understand it, I don't really get it, but okay. And I'm like, fine, we can work with that.
Sure.
Like, I'm here to try and help you with whatever, as opposed to another family member who'd lost a friend and was going through stuff, asked his mom for therapy, and she just said, oh, no, like, you just need to pray more. And he just shut down. She's not trying to shut him down, but she felt unnerved. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what the resources were. And she just kind of wanted to go away and reassure him. But instead, right, he's no longer willing to talk to her about whatever he's feeling.
Yeah, no, those are really great insights and points. And going back to my book that I wrote, you hit on something that was really important in terms of communication. One of the themes coming out of my book is, this idea that as parents and as family members, we need to make these conversations that we're having less awkward. There's a
Mhm.
certain amount of awkwardness, I think, particularly for adolescents. I don't know about you, Dr. Hsu, but I feel like if we can raise these conversations to the level of, say, when we're at college orientation starting in 2021, where you find out about the freshman 15, you find out where the kids can get condoms and contraceptives if they're in relationships, and then, oh, by the way, let's spend a few minutes on depression, anxiety, and a very real stat that 1 out of 4 college students is probably going to suffer from depression.
Mhm. Right. And I think some studies say about 45% of graduate students. And so these are very, college students, graduates, they're all very smart, accomplished people. And I think what we're often not taught when we're in school is that maybe being smart or achieving certain things is actually an entirely different subject than how are we feeling about our values, our belonging, our moods, our emotional health, right? That we get confused. And for students, that can be very confusing, and for parents as well. I've had parents say, well, gosh, their grades were good, so I just figured everything's fine. Or I would have been happy to help them if they had come to me. But of course, when you're very young, sometimes you can't even articulate like what is going on. You know, um, we've literally had kids that will ask them, are you being bullied? Are you feeling things? And they'll be like, no. But then when you name the actual behaviors or things, it's like, well, that's actually bullying, or that's actually what it feels like to have anxiety disorder. So they may not be able to articulate actually what it is that they may be experiencing or needing. And so to normalize being able to have these conversations, um, and finding out the resources. I always say it's like your emergency earthquake kit. It's best to scope things out before you need it in that moment.
So true. So true.
Yeah.
That's a very,
Mm-hmm.
very, very good point. And, again, we're here with Dr. Helen Hsu, our special guest, as we continue this conversation here with the Avery Burton Foundation on back to school, COVID-19 and the coronavirus era. You can watch, if you just joined us, you can watch the replay and the video of this discussion at averyburtonfoundation.org. And Dr. Hsu was very kind and generous to send over some resources as well to share with all of you and other families as you deal with these issues. In the remaining time that we have, Dr. Hsu, I wanted to ask you, I know Stanford is on a quarter system, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So you have had a little bit of time to try to get ready. I know we just finished up in Tempe, dropping my son off. I think he's not on this call. He should be buying books right now. I hope that's where he is. But he's at Arizona State, and the move-in was pretty smooth, a little hot, but other than that, um, what are some of the things that you are thinking about as you prepare to have students coming back to your office on the campus of Stanford in probably a few weeks?
Mm-hmm. Some of the main things, of course, are really thinking about how are we going to cope with this ongoing isolation that, depending on which campus we're at, some students are extremely isolated, have very strict protocols in their county, and others maybe have some more opportunities to have a social pod, but it's definitely not the normal experience. So whatever age our students are right now, none of them are having the totally normal school socialization experience, which I always say is a huge part of our education. It's not just the stuff we learn and we get tested on. Social emotional learning is actually fundamental to lifelong relationship health and success. I often point out to people, who uses our counseling services more than any other department? It's the Graduate School of Business. And
Interesting.
people often feel very surprised because they're known for being very cutthroat, the most accomplished, one of the top business schools. But their program emphasizes you've got to know yourself. You've got to know yourself to be in a good place, to be an influencer, to be a good communicator. And that's a really important thing to teach. Are we teaching social emotional learning and skills beyond just the curriculum, academic content? Are we teaching them to advocate? So right now, parents, unfortunately, there's a ton of advocacy that I know has already been going on. Like, how do we get proper childcare? How do we get proper resources for students that need it? If my student has needs like a major mental health episodes, they have a legal right to an individualized education plan. They have rights when they're in college to accommodations if they are unwell for any reason. And unfortunately, sometimes we have to push for those rights.
So let me stop. Let me
Mm-hmm.
stop you there for just a moment. So for the
Mm-hmm.
parents that are watching right now, I want to emphasize the point that you just made.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you're spending a lot of money on your child's education. In some cases, it's an elite, school like a Stanford and others, or a Loyola Marymount. You're spending a lot out of state tuition. You have certain rights and privileges that come along with just writing that check to that academic institution. So for all the parents out there, again, I think one of the themes that we've been discussing here is be proactive and be strategic in terms of what outcomes you're hoping for in terms of your child's well-being and their
Mm-hmm.
mental health.
You advocate for them, and hopefully you're giving them tools to eventually advocate for themselves. Um, in K-12 education, public schools, your child has rights to accommodations or IEPs if they need it. Um, and I'll be honest, I spent many years working in K-12, and often students wouldn't get those rights because maybe their parent was an immigrant and didn't know, and then they just wouldn't get it, you know? Um, and so there's the inequities in our society that we know that maybe to get the best therapist from our insurer, to get the proper accommodation for our kid, whether that's K-12 or beyond, we have to sometimes really, how are we assertive? How are we researching? And how are we responding to and providing supports for whatever is happening? Because there's also just the unexpected things, like there may be relationship issues, there may be friend issues. I do a lot of grief and loss work on our campus, and that grief and loss in the age of COVID are going to touch us all. You can't lose this many people nationwide and not have it impact us. And grief and loss is terrible for everyone, but it is especially challenging for a lot of our young people who may be the first among their friends to have had a death in the family, who don't know, how do we talk about this? How do we integrate this? How do I have to reprocess this at every one of my own developmental levels? So just knowing that there's all these intersecting factors right now that we are dealing with a lot.
That's a really good point, Dr. Hsu, and I think we'll end it there. This has been a really important conversation, and I appreciate you being our special guest. Again, this is Dr. Helen Hsu. She's a staff psychologist and a lecturer at Stanford University, and we've been talking about mental health and how to sort of protect ourselves as we all think about sending our students back to college and on campus during this era of coronavirus. In the final minutes, Dr. Hsu, I wanted to ask, how can people connect with you on social media? I know you're pretty active on social.
Mm-hmm. There's a surprising great amount of mental health education info on social media. So definitely, on Instagram, it's Hella Mental Health.
I love that. I love that. Say
Right,
it
it's
again.
very Northern California. Hella Mental Health, that's Hella Mental Health. That's on Instagram. I'm Helen Hsu, PsyD, PSYD. That's my degree on Twitter. And I just started to put things on YouTube also under Dr. Helen Hsu. And the links that I've sent to Reggie, look those up because they get into a little more detail about things like how do I as a parent modulate my own emotions and stress at this time so that I can handle, truly unprecedented stressors right now for the learning environment. I know we only got to touch on some things, but there's a lot of good stuff available out there now, and really take a look. We're all kind of making this up as we fly the plane, but to do so in community and really pulling in all the resources is the best way we're going to get through it.
Well, I think we'll end it on that note, but we are in this together because this impacts so many people across the country. And, we hope that you'll check this out on our YouTube channel, Avery Burton Foundation. .org is our website where those resources will be if you need them. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. We appreciate our special guests as well. And stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great school year.
That's right. Take care, everybody. Thanks for
you.
having me.
You too. You bet. Thank you.